Imagine you stand on the bustling docks of ancient Alexandria. The scent of salt and exotic spices fills the air. Sunlight glints off distant pyramids. But beneath this vibrant surface, a quiet dread begins to ripple through the crowded streets. You notice a cough here, a fevered brow there. You see faces etched with a growing fear, a fear not of an invading army, but of an unseen, insidious force. We often learn of empires rising and falling through conquest and diplomacy. Yet, a more fundamental, more terrifying architect of ruin often goes unmentioned. These are the forgotten plagues, silent scourges that swept across continents, decimated populations, and fundamentally reshaped the course of human history. They were the microscopic monarchs, the true power brokers who brought the greatest civilizations to their knees. This is their story and ours. You watch the sun climb higher above the shimmering waters of the great harbor. A light that once promised warmth and prosperity now feels strangely cold. That cough you heard yesterday on the docks has spread. It is now a chorus, a dry rasping sound echoing from the narrow alleyways. A baker's wife you know, usually bustling with energy, now lies still behind her counter, her skin flushed, her breath ragged. Fear, a quiet, insidious thing, begins to creep through the city like a fog. It settles in the market stalls, it whispers in the temples, it hangs heavy in the air, thick and cloying as the humidity. This is not the clash of swords or the rumble of chariots. This is something far more ancient, far more primal. We often imagine history as a grand tapestry woven with the threads of kings and queens, battles and treaties, innovations and discoveries. But beneath that visible weave, another, darker pattern runs. It is stitched by the unseen hand of disease, a force that has shaped civilizations as profoundly as any emperor or general. These are the forgotten plagues, not just historical footnotes, but seismic events that shattered societies and rerouted the entire river of human progress. They are the silent architects of doom, the microscopic forces that brought the mightiest empires to their knees. Consider for a moment the very dawn of human civilization. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived in small nomadic bands. While they faced dangers from predators and starvation, widespread, devastating epidemics were rare. Their transient lifestyle, their sparse populations, meant that pathogens struggled to find enough hosts to sustain themselves. A localized illness might sweep through a small group, but it would often burn itself out before it could jump to another, distant community. Life was harsh, yes, but the scale of disease was small. Then came the agricultural revolution. You see it unfold across the Fertile Crescent, along the great rivers in the verdant valleys. Humans began to settle, to cultivate land, to domesticate animals. This was a turning point, a monumental shift that brought immense benefits. Food became more reliable, populations grew, and complex societies began to emerge. But with these advancements came an unforeseen, deadly consequence. Proximity. You are no longer a lone hunter in a vast wilderness. You live in a village, then a town, then a burgeoning city. Your home is now a fixed structure, often sharing walls with neighbors. Your food comes from fields tilled by many hands, and from animals kept in close quarters. Sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, creatures that once roamed free now live alongside you, often in the same shelters or just outside your door. With this unprecedented closeness, a new kind of interaction began. Viruses and bacteria, long adapted to animal hosts, found new opportunities. They mutated, they jumped species, and they found in human settlements a perfect breeding ground. Imagine the cramped conditions of an early city. There is no plumbing as you know it. Waste accumulates in the streets, mingling with refuse from kitchens and workshops. Water sources are often shared, easily contaminated. A child plays in the street, then touches her mouth. A merchant handles goods, then wipes his brow. The very fabric of daily life becomes a network of transmission. Each cough, each sneeze, each unwashed hand becomes a tiny, unwitting vector, scattering the seeds of disease. Before the understanding of microbes, before the very concept of germs, how did people comprehend this invisible onslaught? When the illness struck, the prevailing theories were often rooted in fear and superstition. You would hear whispers of divine wrath, a punishment from angry gods for some unknown transgression. Perhaps the air itself was tainted, a poisonous miasma rising from swamps or decaying matter. You might see healers trying ancient remedies, incantations, or sacrifices, desperate to appease the forces they believed were behind the suffering. But nothing seemed to stem the tide. The terror of these early plagues was magnified by their mystery. You watched as strong men withered in days, as children's faces grew pale and cold. There was no explanation, no clear enemy to fight, no visible wound to mend. It was an invisible hand squeezing the life out of your community, plucking away loved ones one by one, leaving behind only grief and confusion. The very foundations of society would begin to crack. Who would tend the fields if everyone was sick? Who would bury the dead when the healthy were too few or too afraid? The economic lifeblood of a city could simply stop flowing. Markets would empty, workshops would fall silent, and the vibrant hum of daily commerce would be replaced by an ominous quiet, punctuated only by the moans of the dying. Consider the trade routes, the arteries of ancient empires. From Alexandria, you can picture ships laden with grain and papyrus setting sail for Rome. Caravans carrying silks and spices journey across vast deserts from the east. These vital connections, which brought wealth and cultural exchange, were also highways for pathogens. A sick sailor, a coughing merchant, a feverish soldier returning from a distant campaign, each could unknowingly carry a deadly cargo. The very interconnectedness that fueled human progress also made us exquisitely vulnerable. The globalized world, in its ancient form, was already a perfect incubator for widespread epidemics. Think of the Silk Road stretching thousands of miles. Along its dusty tracks, not just exotic goods traveled, but also microscopic invaders, adapting and mutating as they moved from one unsuspecting community to another. A disease originating in the grasslands of Central Asia could, within months or years, arrive on the shores of the Mediterranean, carried by one caravan after another, jumping from host to host, village to village, until it reached a bustling metropolis like yours. These were the virgin soil epidemics. When a new pathogen encountered a population that had never been exposed to it before, with no inherited immunity, the results were often catastrophic. It was like a fire sweeping through dry tinder. The disease would spread with terrifying speed and lethality, leaving behind a trail of devastation that could wipe out entire communities, or even entire civilizations in a remarkably short span of time. You stand in the midst of this growing dread, watching as the vibrant life of Alexandria slowly dims. The usual boisterous laughter from the taverns has faded. The steady rhythmic chants of the laborers are replaced by the somber tolling of bells, signaling yet another funeral. You see the faces of your neighbors not just grim with worry, but etched with a profound sense of helplessness. This is the initial wave, the insidious beginning of what will become known as the Plague of Justinian, a scourge that will tear through the Roman world, forever altering its destiny. But before empires crumble, before civilizations fall, there is this moment of dawning realization, of quiet horror, as the unseen enemy tightens its grip. The whispers of pestilence have become a roar, and the seeds of ancient doom have begun to sprout. You recoil from the nascent horror of Alexandria, the chill of a future plague settling in your bones. But let us step back, far further than the bustling docks of Byzantium, further even than the golden age of Justinian. Let us journey centuries before, to an earlier tremor, a seismic shock that first rattled the mighty foundations of Rome itself. Imagine, if you will, the Roman Empire at the very height of its power. It is the 2nd century after the birth of Christ. You stand in the heart of the capital, a city of 1,000,000 souls, gleaming white marble under a Mediterranean sun. This is the era of the 5 good emperors, a period of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and enlightened rule. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, sits on the throne. His wisdom and justice are renowned throughout the known world. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, stretches from the misty shores of Britannia to the scorching deserts of Arabia. Legions guard the frontiers, trade routes hum with activity, and intellectual life flourishes. You feel the pulse of a confident, seemingly invincible civilization. The forum bustles with senators, merchants, and citizens discussing politics, philosophy, and the latest gladiatorial games. The air is thick with the scent of spices, the murmur of 100 languages, and the distant clang of hammers from new construction projects. Rome feels eternal, unassailable. But unseen, unheard, a different kind of invader was already making its journey, carried not by ships of war but by the breath of men. It began in the east, in the distant land of Parthia, where Rome's legions had been campaigning. In the year 165, the Roman general Lucius Verus, co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius, marched his victorious troops home from the siege of Seleucia, a great city on the Tigris River. You can picture them, these hardened veterans, dusty and triumphant, eager for the parades and accolades awaiting them in Rome. They carried with them spoils of war, tales of valor, and an invisible passenger. The first whispers of illness began in the camps. A soldier coughs. Another complains of a fever that racks his body, a searing heat that no amount of cool water can soothe. Soon rashes appear, angry red pustules erupting on the skin, a torment that leaves him weak and gasping. You watch as a robust legionary, a man who has faced down the fiercest enemies, suddenly collapses, his eyes glazed with delirium. The camp medics, trained in setting bones and dressing wounds, are baffled. This is something new, something terrifyingly potent. As the legions made their slow, triumphant journey homeward, the plague spread like brush fire through dry kindling. It moved with the soldiers, infecting the local populations they encountered, hitching rides on supply trains, silently infiltrating towns and villages along the great Roman roads. From Mesopotamia, it reached Anatolia, then Syria. It crossed the Mediterranean to Egypt, then spread into Greece and Italy. By the time it reached the heart of the empire, it had already claimed countless lives. You see the bustling port of Ostia, where ships from every corner of the empire unload their goods. It is here that the pestilence, carried by returning soldiers and merchants, truly gains its foothold in Italy. From Ostia, it is a short, unstoppable march along the Via Ostiensis into the city of Rome itself. The initial cases are dismissed as isolated incidents, perhaps bad food, or the usual seasonal fevers. But the numbers grow relentlessly, exponentially. Imagine walking through the Forum now, just a few months later. The vibrant energy has dissipated, replaced by a suffocating pall. The air, once filled with the animated chatter of citizens, is now heavy with the stench of sickness and the pervasive odor of death. Funeral pyres burn incessantly on the outskirts of the city, their smoke a constant reminder of the unseen enemy. You see families, once proud and numerous, reduced to a handful of survivors. Fear, a far more insidious contagion, spreads faster than the disease itself. The symptoms are agonizing. The fever, the excruciating headache, the burning thirst. Then come the skin lesions, disfiguring eruptions that scar the body and often lead to blindness. Severe diarrhea and vomiting dehydrate the victims, leaving them frail shadows of their former selves. The renowned physician Galen, personal doctor to Marcus Aurelius, meticulously observed the disease, documenting its course. He describes the black exanthem, the pustules turning dark and scabbing over. Though he did not know it, what he was witnessing was likely a virulent strain of smallpox, or possibly measles, introduced to a population with no natural immunity. Galen, however, eventually fled the city, abandoning his patients in the face of such overwhelming devastation. His flight underscores the helplessness even the most learned felt against this invisible foe. The impact on Rome's military was catastrophic. The legions, the very backbone of the empire, were decimated. Imagine the northern frontiers, along the Rhine and the Danube, now guarded by weakened, understrength garrisons. The barbarian tribes, ever watchful, sensed this vulnerability. Border incursions became more frequent, more daring. The empire, once secure, now bled from 1,000 small wounds. You can almost hear the distant shouts of raiding parties, growing bolder as the Roman defenses falter. Economically, the empire reeled. Trade routes that once flowed freely now slowed to a trickle as merchants feared contagion. Fields lay fallow as laborers died or fled. Cities, once vital centers of commerce and craftsmanship, became ghost towns, their workshops silent, their markets empty. The sheer scale of death created a labor crisis, impacting everything from agriculture to mining. Grain prices soared. Taxes went uncollected. The vast, intricate machinery of the Roman economy began to grind to a halt. You see the worried faces of senators trying to make sense of plummeting revenues and empty granaries. Socially, the plague tore at the very fabric of Roman society. Superstition flourished. People sought explanations, scapegoats. Christians, a minority group already viewed with suspicion, were often blamed for incurring the wrath of the gods. Persecutions intensified. The traditional Roman gods, once seen as protectors, were now questioned. Why had they abandoned their people? Why had they allowed such suffering? You hear the desperate prayers, the frantic sacrifices, offering everything to appease angry deities. But the plague continued its relentless march, indifferent to human supplication. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, faced an unimaginable crisis. He was not only a philosopher but a pragmatic ruler. He instituted public health measures as best as they could understand them. He organized mass burials to prevent further spread of disease. He even sold off imperial possessions, including priceless statues and tapestries, to fund relief efforts and recruit new soldiers to fill the depleted ranks. You see him, a man of profound intellect and calm demeanor, wrestling with a catastrophe that defied all reason and understanding. He fought the plague with every resource at his disposal, but it was a fight against an invisible, implacable enemy. The Antonine Plague raged for 15 long years, from 165 to 180. It is estimated to have claimed millions of lives, perhaps as many as 10% of the empire's entire population. Some scholars suggest even 25 to 30% in certain regions. Imagine the sheer devastation. Generations lost. Families obliterated. The vibrant, confident empire of Marcus Aurelius was left irrevocably scarred. This was Rome's first great pandemic, a seismic shock that left cracks in its seemingly impenetrable facade. It did not immediately cause the empire to fall, but it severely weakened it, marking a turning point. It depleted manpower, strained resources, and eroded faith in the traditional order. It ushered in a period of instability and foreshadowed the greater crises that would plague Rome in the centuries to come. You understand now that even the mightiest empires are fragile, vulnerable to the smallest, unseen foe. As you step away from the devastation of Antonine Rome, the echoes of its suffering reverberate. You realize that the quiet horror you witnessed in Alexandria, the insidious beginning of the plague of Justinian, is not an isolated event. It is a terrifying rerun, a fresh manifestation of an ancient enemy. Rome had faced such an adversary before, and though it had endured, it was never truly the same. The shadow of Antonine's plague lingered, a chilling reminder of how quickly power and prosperity can crumble in the face of a microscopic threat. The seeds of ancient doom had indeed sprouted, not for the first time, but with a terrible, familiar vengeance. You stand now in the heart of Rome, not the bustling, confident capital you might imagine, but one shrouded in an invisible fear, a full 3 centuries before the horrors of Justinian's time. The air here feels different, heavier somehow, carrying an unspoken dread that seems to cling to the very stones of the eternal city. The echoes of an ancient doom, a vengeance you have already encountered, find a renewed and terrifying strength here in the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era. You feel the chill of it, a premonition of what is to come. This is the Rome of emperors like Marcus Aurelius, a city at the apparent zenith of its power, its legions formidable, its culture vibrant, its infrastructure awe-inspiring. Yet, even in this era of imperial glory, a microscopic assassin was already being smuggled into its very core. You watch as legions, triumphant but exhausted, return from distant Parthia in the east. They march through triumphal arches, their armor gleaming, but beneath the celebratory fanfare, something insidious travels with them. A sickness, initially dismissed as the usual camp fever, a weariness from prolonged campaigning. But it is far more than that. It is a contagion that will rip through the empire, leaving an indelible scar. In this moment of mounting crisis, a towering intellect stands ready, if not to conquer the disease, then at least to meticulously document its devastating march. You see him now, a figure of intense focus and relentless curiosity, Galen of Pergamon. He is arguably the greatest physician of the ancient world, a man whose medical theories would dominate Western thought for over 1,000 years. Imagine him, a man of profound learning and sharp observation, moving through the teeming streets of Rome, his mind a whirlwind of anatomical knowledge and clinical experience. You observe him in his prime, a trusted healer to emperors, a brilliant anatomist, a tireless researcher. He is the ultimate diagnostician of his age, and yet, even he will be brought to his knees by this unseen enemy. The first cases appear subtly, almost innocuously, among the returning soldiers. You hear their coughs, their complaints of chills and aches. Then the symptoms worsen. High fevers, intractable diarrhea, severe sore throats, and most distressingly, a gruesome rash that blossoms into pustules, often black and crusty. It is a sight that horrifies even seasoned medical practitioners like Galen. He examines the lesions, feels the fevered skin, listens to the labored breathing. You stand beside him, a silent observer in his clinic, watching as he tries to make sense of what he is seeing. He notes the systemic nature of the illness, its rapid progression, and its terrifyingly high mortality rate. This is not a common ailment. This is something new, something unprecedented in its virulence. As the plague takes hold, you witness its relentless spread from the military camps into the heart of the city. The narrow, crowded alleyways of Rome, the multi-story insulae where families live packed together, become ideal breeding grounds. The disease moves with terrifying speed, striking down rich and poor alike, though the poor, living in squalid conditions, are often its first and most numerous victims. The initial murmurs of concern swell into a chorus of panic. The vibrant life of Rome begins to dim. Galen, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the suffering, retreats temporarily to his estate in Pergamon, perhaps seeking to escape the contagion, but more likely to process the overwhelming clinical data he has gathered and to protect himself for future study. However, the plague follows him. No corner of the empire is safe. He eventually returns to Rome, summoned by the emperors Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius, who themselves are grappling with this devastating scourge. You see Galen now back in Rome attempting to bring order to the chaos. He describes his patients suffering from what he calls a great catarrh, a severe respiratory infection, alongside the eruptive pustules. He documents the progression, the high fever, the internal ulcerations, the extreme exhaustion. He applies what remedies he can devise, bloodletting, herbal concoctions, careful dietary regimens, but often to no avail. The sheer number of sick and dying is staggering. The death toll rises relentlessly. You hear the mournful cries from homes, the constant procession of funeral pyres, the desperate prayers offered to gods who seem to have abandoned their people. The impact of what historians now call the Antonine Plague, though its precise identity remains debated, possibly smallpox or a severe form of measles, is catastrophic. You walk through the streets and see the demographic devastation. Villages are emptied. Entire families are wiped out. The once bustling Roman countryside becomes silent, its fields left fallow for lack of labor. The agricultural backbone of the empire begins to crack under the strain. This is not merely a medical crisis. It is an existential threat to the very fabric of Roman society. The legions, already weakened by years of campaigning, are decimated. You can almost feel the vulnerability of the empire's vast borders, now guarded by dwindling numbers of soldiers. The military machine, once Rome's invincible shield, is now a shadow of its former self, its ranks thinned by disease, its morale shattered. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, finds himself on the Danubian frontier, facing barbarian incursions with an army crippled by the plague. He is forced to recruit gladiators, slaves, and even bandits into his legions, a desperate measure that underscores the severity of the manpower crisis. Economically, the empire reels. You see trade routes disrupted, markets closed, and craftsmen idle. The flow of goods and wealth grinds to a halt. Taxes go uncollected from a shrinking, impoverished population. The carefully balanced imperial economy, so dependent on a robust workforce and extensive commerce, spirals into decline. The Roman treasury, once overflowing, is drained by the costs of war and the immense relief efforts required to cope with the plague. Socially, the bonds that hold communities together begin to fray. Fear and suspicion run rampant. You witness the breakdown of public services, the abandonment of the sick, and the rise of superstition and despair. Faith in the traditional Roman gods wavers as prayers go unanswered and sacrifices seem to offer no protection. Cults offering solace and healing gain traction, signaling a shift in the spiritual landscape of the empire. Galen, through his meticulous, if ultimately frustrated, observations, offers a lament not just for the dying, but for the dying empire he serves. He grapples with a foe that defies his vast knowledge, a biological weapon that renders his most sophisticated treatments impotent. He witnesses firsthand the erosion of the imperial might, the profound suffering of its people, and the slow, agonizing unraveling of a golden age. His writings, though sometimes cryptic to modern eyes, are a testament to the horror he experienced, a clinical diary of Rome's vulnerability. The Antonine Plague is more than just an epidemic. It is a profound historical turning point. You can sense it in the air, in the eyes of the survivors. It marks the end of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of unparalleled stability and prosperity. It ushers in the tumultuous crisis of the 3rd century, a period of civil war, economic collapse, and relentless barbarian invasions that will bring the empire to its knees. This plague, the unseen enemy carried back by victorious legions, sows the seeds of Rome's gradual decline. It depletes the population, weakens the military, disrupts the economy, and shakes the very confidence of the Roman people in their destiny. It is a wound from which the empire will never truly recover, a deep scar that leaves it permanently weakened, more susceptible to future shocks. You realize now that the devastation you witnessed in Justinian's time, the horrors of Alexandria, the emptying of Constantinople, are not singular events. They are the terrifying echoes of a pattern established centuries earlier. The Antonine Plague was a dress rehearsal, a chilling preview of how easily even the most powerful civilization can be brought low by a microscopic adversary. It redefined the limits of imperial power, exposing Rome's profound fragility. It was a lament, yes, a lament for the dead, but also a lament for the beginning of the end of an era, a mournful whisper of an empire's slow descent. The forgotten plagues, as you now understand, were not just medical tragedies. They were the silent architects of imperial destiny. The forgotten plagues, as you now understand, were not just medical tragedies. They were the silent architects of imperial destiny. And just as the Antonine Plague etched its deep scar upon the Roman world, so too would another, far more devastating pestilence, carve an abyss into the heart of the Byzantine Empire. You stand on the cusp of the 6th century, in an empire that gleams with renewed ambition, a civilization poised, or so it seems, to reclaim its ancient glory. This is the world of Justinian, a formidable emperor with an unwavering vision, to restore the Roman Empire to its former magnificent scope. You walk through the bustling streets of Constantinople, the new Rome. The city pulses with life, a vibrant tapestry of commerce, power, and faith. Its towering walls, its magnificent churches, its sprawling markets filled with exotic goods from every corner of the known world, all speak of an empire at its zenith. Justinian has brought much of the old Roman West back under imperial control, from North Africa to Italy. His armies are formidable, his legal reforms profound, his architectural achievements like the Hagia Sophia, simply breathtaking. You feel a sense of optimism, a belief that the tide has turned, that Rome in its Eastern incarnation is truly eternal. The empire is a beacon, a center of art, learning, and unstoppable military might. But beneath this glittering surface, a terrifying shadow is gathering. You hear whispers, faint at first, carried on the trade winds from Egypt, the empire's breadbasket. Sailors speak of a strange, swift sickness, a fever that consumes the body, followed by swellings, black and angry, in the armpits and groin. They call it the buboes. These are not merely rumors for you. You have seen this before. You recognize the chilling symptoms of the Antonine Plague, but something about these new accounts feels far more virulent, more insidious. The year is 541. You watch as the disease makes its way inexorably up the Nile, then spreads like wildfire across the fertile lands of Egypt. It moves along the great maritime trade routes, hopping from port to port, carried by the very ships that fuel Constantinople's prosperity. Soon, it reaches Gaza, then Antioch, then Syria, then the imperial capital itself. You are in Constantinople when it strikes. The initial cases are dismissed as isolated incidents, perhaps a particularly nasty seasonal illness. But then the numbers climb. They accelerate with a terrifying, unnatural speed. Within days you see healthy people suddenly seized by fever, their minds clouding, their bodies racked with pain. The telltale buboes appear, often within hours. Death follows swiftly, mercilessly. The city, once so alive with noise, begins to fall silent. The markets empty. The grand hippodrome, usually roaring with the cheers of thousands, becomes a haunting echo chamber. Shops close not for lack of business, but because there is no one left to run them, or no one brave enough to venture out. You walk down streets that were once thronged with people and now they are eerily quiet, save for the chilling sound of funeral dirges or the desperate cries of the dying. The scale of the death is unimaginable. Historians of the time, those who survived to write, speak of 10,000 deaths a day at the peak of the plague in Constantinople. 10,000 souls, every single day. You see the bodies piling up in the streets, too numerous for traditional burials. The public spaces, the open squares, become makeshift graveyards. Graves are dug with desperate haste, pits crammed full of the dead, layered one on top of the other like cordwood. When the ground runs out, they load the bodies onto ships, sailing them out into the Marmara Sea, sinking them, a final desperate act to rid the city of its decaying burden. The air itself grows thick with the stench of death, a sickly sweet, unforgettable smell that permeates everything. Fear paralyzes the city. People become suspicious of every cough, every sneeze. Neighbors avoid each other. Friends abandon friends. Even families fragment as the healthy flee, leaving the sick to perish alone. You witness acts of extraordinary courage, of course, but also of profound despair and utter selfishness. The social fabric frays stretched to its breaking point. Then the unthinkable happens. Emperor Justinian himself falls ill. The news spreads like a cold shockwave through the terrified populace. If even the divinely appointed emperor, the very embodiment of imperial power, can be struck down, what hope is there for anyone else? For a time his life hangs in the balance. You feel the collective breath of the empire catch, waiting, praying, fearing the worst. Miraculously, Justinian recovers, but he emerges from the ordeal a changed man. The plague leaves him physically weakened, perhaps even psychologically scarred, a shadow of his former energetic self. His grand vision, his boundless ambition, seems to dim. The plague does not confine itself to Constantinople. It sweeps through the entire empire, following the trade routes, the military roads, the very arteries of Roman civilization. It devastates cities, empties villages, decimates the countryside. Estimates vary, but some suggest that the Justinianic plague may have killed between 25 and 50 million people, perhaps even more. In some regions, it wiped out a third, even half, of the population. This is not a fleeting illness. It is a demographic catastrophe that rips the very heart out of the Byzantine world. The economic consequences are immediate and catastrophic. With so many dead, there are not enough farmers to tend the fields. Harvests fail. Famine, a grim companion to plague, follows in its wake. There are no artisans to craft goods, no merchants to trade them. The labor force collapses. Taxes, the lifeblood of any empire, dry up as the tax-paying population dwindles and economic activity grinds to a halt. The complex, sophisticated economy of the Byzantine Empire is shattered. Justinian's ambitious military campaigns, already straining the empire's resources, are brought to a grinding halt. His armies, once so formidable, are decimated by the disease. Troops fall ill in droves. Recruits are impossible to find. The reconquest of the Western Roman Empire, a dream that seemed so close to realization, fades into an impossible fantasy. Italy, newly reclaimed from the Goths, is once again plunged into chaos and vulnerability. The empire's frontiers, once fiercely defended, become porous. External enemies, sensing weakness, begin to press in. The Avars and Slavs move into the Balkans. The Persian Empire, the Byzantine Empire's traditional rival in the East, sees an opportunity. The plague's impact is not just demographic or economic or military. It is deeply psychological and spiritual. Many interpret the plague as divine punishment, a sign of God's wrath. Superstition flourishes. Despair becomes endemic. The confident, forward-looking spirit of early Byzantium gives way to a more somber, introspective, even fatalistic worldview. The optimism of the classical age, already fading, is extinguished by this horrific scourge. This, you realize, is not merely another epidemic. This is a foundational catastrophe, a turning point in history. The Antonine Plague was a warning, a prelude. The Justinianic Plague is the event itself, the devastating blow that fundamentally reorients the course of the Eastern Roman Empire. It cripples Byzantium at its perceived peak, robbing it of the manpower, resources, and confidence needed to sustain its grand imperial ambitions. The empire will survive, yes, but it will be a profoundly different entity. It will be smaller, poorer, and constantly under threat. The Justinianic Plague forces the empire to retrench, to focus on survival rather than expansion. It sets the stage for centuries of struggle, for a slow, agonizing process of adaptation and reduction. This forgotten plague, far more than any barbarian invasion or political upheaval, is the silent architect that reshapes the world you now inhabit. It is the beginning of the Byzantine abyss, a descent into an era of diminished power, persistent conflict, and the haunting memory of what might have been. The empire, much like Justinian himself after his recovery, is forever changed, forever scarred by this microscopic killer. You stand in the shadow of an empire, contemplating the devastation wrought by an invisible force, a silent architect of ruin. But what exactly was this microscopic killer that so profoundly reshaped the world you now explore? To understand its impact, you must first understand its blueprint, its insidious mechanism of destruction. At the heart of the Justinianic Plague, and indeed all subsequent bubonic outbreaks for centuries, was a tiny bacterium, a single-celled organism that thrives in the most unassuming of hosts. Its name, for modern understanding, is Yersinia pestis. But to the people of the 6th century, it was simply an incomprehensible curse, a divine wrath. This bacterium did not travel through the air in great clouds of contagion, nor did it leap directly from person to person in every instance. Its journey was more complex, more sinister, orchestrated by the very creatures that shared human spaces. Imagine yourself in the crowded alleys of Constantinople, or any port city of the Roman world. Food is abundant, refuse piles high, and everywhere, scurrying through the shadows, are rats. Black rats, brown rats, small, quick, and omnipresent. These rodents were the primary reservoir for the plague bacterium. They themselves would sicken and die in droves, often unseen, their hidden deaths a grim prelude to the human tragedy. But the rat was not the direct executioner. Its role was to carry a far more insidious agent, the flea. You cannot see them, but they are there. Tiny, dark specks, barely larger than a pinhead, these parasites live on the bodies of rats, drinking their blood. When a flea bites an infected rat, it ingests the Yersinia pestis bacteria. The bacteria then multiply rapidly within the flea's gut, eventually forming a sticky, impenetrable mass that blocks its stomach. The flea, now ravenously hungry but unable to feed properly, becomes frantic. It will bite again and again, desperately trying to clear the blockage. And this is where the unseen killer makes its leap into your world. When the infected, starving flea bites a human, it regurgitates a portion of the bacterial blockage directly into the bloodstream. A tiny, almost imperceptible prick of the skin, and the fate of an individual, an entire family, a city, an empire, is sealed. Within days, sometimes mere hours, the symptoms begin. You might first feel a general malaise, a profound weariness that settles deep into your bones. A sudden chill, then an uncontrollable fever. Your head aches, your muscles ache, and a profound nausea grips you. But the signature of this specific plague, its telltale sign, manifests swiftly. You feel a tenderness, a painful swelling in the lymph nodes closest to the site of the flea bite. Perhaps in your armpit or your groin or along your neck. These swellings, known as buboes, grow rapidly, becoming incredibly painful, sometimes reaching the size of an apple or even an orange. They are hot to the touch, often turning dark purple or black, oozing pus and blood. They are the body's desperate, failing attempt to contain the invading bacteria. As the infection spreads unchecked through your lymphatic system and into your bloodstream, your body descends into chaos. Your heart races, your breath becomes shallow and ragged. You might experience agonizing abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. Hemorrhages appear beneath your skin, forming dark blotches, giving the plague its common name in later centuries, the Black Death. You might hallucinate, consumed by delirium as the toxins overwhelm your system. The stench of your own disease becomes inescapable, a sickly sweet odor of decay even as you live. Death, when it comes, is often swift and brutal. For many, it strikes within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms, sometimes even faster. The mortality rate was astronomical, often reaching 60, 70, or even 90% in affected communities. Imagine the terror of seeing nearly everyone you know succumb to such a swift, agonizing end. Imagine the despair as you watch the buboes swell on your own loved ones, knowing what it means, knowing the almost inevitable outcome. The cities, with their dense populations and close quarters, were incubators for this terror. Rats thrived in the granaries, the marketplaces, the residential areas. Fleas moved easily from rat to human, and sometimes from human to human, even without the rat intermediary, through close contact with the sick or their contaminated belongings. The very infrastructure of urban life, designed for commerce and community, became a superhighway for the plague. From the cities, the plague traveled along the vital arteries of the empire, the trade routes. Caravans carrying silks and spices, ships laden with grain and oil, soldiers marching to distant garrisons. Each served as an unwitting vector, carrying infected rats and their deadly fleas from one unsuspecting settlement to the next. The vast interconnectedness that defined the Roman world, its strength in unity and exchange, became its fatal vulnerability. This was not a singular event. The Justinianic plague was the first documented pandemic of bubonic plague, but it was far from the last. For the next 200 years, wave after wave of the plague would sweep across the empire, decimating generations. Just as the population began to recover, just as towns started to rebuild, another outbreak would strike, pulling the rug out from under any nascent resurgence. Each recurrence was a fresh hammer blow, preventing recovery, perpetuating scarcity, and cementing a culture of fear and constant loss. This relentless, invisible enemy was more devastating than any barbarian horde or internal rebellion. It did not merely conquer land, it annihilated people. It emptied cities, stripped armies of their strength, and starved the empire of its very lifeblood, its human capital. It was a silent, insidious force, operating with a ruthless biological blueprint, patiently eroding the foundations of a civilization that had believed itself eternal. It was this microscopic killer that dictated the course of empires, a hidden hand writing a new, bleaker chapter in human history. The microscopic killer that dictated the course of empires did not arise in isolation. It had a journey, a pathway carved not by conquest or political ambition, but by the relentless human drive for connection, for wealth, for exotic wonders. You stand now at the crossroads of continents, feeling the dust of ancient trade routes settling on your skin. Imagine the Silk Road. It is not a single path, but a vast, intricate web of arteries stretching for thousands of miles, a pulsing network connecting east and west, an incredible testament to human ingenuity and endurance. You hear the rhythmic crunch of camel hooves on sun-baked earth, the jingling of their bells, the creak of laden carts. The air is thick with the scent of exotic spices, pungent silks, cured hides, and the sweat of men and beasts. You see the glint of sunlight on precious metals, the vibrant dyes of textiles, the shimmering surfaces of porcelain. Merchants from lands you can barely imagine haggle in a cacophony of languages, their faces weathered by sun and wind. This is the heartbeat of the ancient world, a vibrant, ceaseless flow of goods and ideas. But what else travels along these routes, hidden in plain sight, unseen by the eager eyes of merchants or the watchful gaze of guards? What insidious passengers hitch a ride in the folds of silk, nested among bales of spices, or scurrying unseen in the hold of a ship navigating the maritime offshoots of the great land routes? The Silk Road, this magnificent conduit of civilization, was also a superhighway for disease. Consider the journey. You might begin in the bustling markets of Chang'an, the imperial capital of China, teeming with perhaps 1 million people. From there you would trek westward, across the treacherous Taklamakan Desert, skirting its edges, relying on oasis towns for water and respite. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. You would pass through remote mountain passes, across vast steppes, encountering nomads and settled peoples alike. Each stop, each interaction, each shared meal around a flickering fire, is a potential point of exchange. Your caravan is a microcosm of life, but also a mobile incubator. You share cramped sleeping quarters with dozens of others. Sanitation is rudimentary at best. Water sources are often shared and sometimes questionable. A cough, a fever, a rash, these are common ailments on such an arduous journey, easily dismissed as the price of travel, the inevitable toll of the road. But some of these ailments carry a far greater menace. Imagine the common rat. It is not an exotic creature, but it is a ubiquitous one. It scuttles through the markets of Central Asia, it nests in the baggage of caravans, it gnaws at grain stores and way stations. And on its back, or more accurately in its fur, lives the flea. And within the flea, for certain devastating diseases, lives the bacteria. This tiny, almost invisible chain of life becomes the vector for widespread death. The Silk Road did not merely carry silk and spices, it carried organisms. It carried the bacteria Yersinia pestis, the very agent responsible for the bubonic plague, the Justinianic plague that ravaged the Roman Empire, and the Black Death that would devastate medieval Europe centuries later. This pathogen, thought to have originated in the vast steppe lands of Central Asia, found its perfect distribution network in the very routes designed to foster prosperity. Think about the conditions. During your journey you might fall ill with a mild fever. You recover, or perhaps you do not. But the bacteria or virus you carried, even if you showed no symptoms, has now been introduced to a new population. A trade fair brings together hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people from different regions. What one person carries innocently, another picks up. And then they carry it further along the route, to the next market, the next city, the next empire. The Justinianic plague, which struck the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, is a prime example of this dark legacy. While its immediate effects were felt most acutely in the Mediterranean basin, its origins trace back along these very trade lines. You can almost trace its footsteps, or rather, the footsteps of the infected rodents and fleas, and the human carriers who unknowingly ferried it across continents. This was not a singular event, a one-off catastrophe. The Silk Road facilitated repeated introductions of disease. Over centuries, different strains of pathogens, different kinds of viruses and bacteria, traversed these same routes. Measles, smallpox, influenza, all found efficient highways in the human networks established for commerce. Each outbreak, whether a regional epidemic or a continental pandemic, chipped away at populations, disrupted societies, and left an indelible mark on history. Consider the relentless nature of these unseen invaders. For example, a caravan departs from one city, carrying infected fleas on its rats. It arrives at an oasis town, trading goods, and the rats disembark, finding new hosts among the local rat population. From there, the disease spreads locally. Another caravan picks up new passengers, human and rodent, and carries the disease further. It is a slow, methodical march across vast distances, a ticking biological clock making its way from one unsuspecting community to the next. The impact was profound. Cities along the Silk Road, once thriving hubs of culture and trade, could become centers of contagion. Their populations, often dense and in close proximity, provided ideal conditions for rapid transmission. Imagine arriving at a bustling city gate, expecting the usual vibrant chaos, only to find an eerie silence, the stench of sickness hanging in the air, houses boarded up, and the few people you see moving like ghosts, their faces etched with fear and despair. The very success of the Silk Road in connecting diverse cultures and economies paradoxically became its greatest weakness in the face of disease. The more robust the trade, the more frequent the travel, the faster and farther the pathogens could spread. Every new shortcut, every faster camel, every larger ship, inadvertently accelerated the reach of these unseen enemies. Empires that relied heavily on these trade routes for their prosperity also made themselves vulnerable. The Roman and Byzantine empires, for instance, were deeply integrated into the global trade network. Their vibrant port cities were not just gateways for silks and spices, but also for fleas on ships and sick travelers. You can almost picture the rats scurrying off a newly docked vessel, bringing their deadly cargo ashore. The forgotten plagues, these relentless waves of sickness, did not just cause individual suffering. They altered the demographic landscape of entire civilizations. They led to labor shortages, famines, social unrest, and a profound sense of fatalism. The belief that one was at the mercy of forces beyond human control became deeply ingrained. The invisible enemy described earlier, the one that annihilated people and emptied cities, found its perfect vehicle in the human desire for connection and commerce. You can trace the invisible threads of contagion woven into the very fabric of history. The rise and fall of dynasties, the shifting of power balances, the changes in religious beliefs, even the development of medical science, all were influenced by these silent travelers. The Silk Road, a symbol of human achievement, carries with it this dark, often overlooked legacy. A network of contagion that shaped the world as profoundly as any emperor or conqueror. You might think of the vastness of the Central Asian steppes, the endless horizons, the feeling of isolation as your caravan makes its way. But even in this perceived isolation, the world is interconnected. A single bite from a flea on a rat, carried from hundreds or even thousands of miles away, could set in motion a chain of events that would devastate an entire continent. The scale of this biological exchange is staggering. We often celebrate the exchange of ideas and goods that flourished along these routes, and rightly so. But we must also acknowledge the full spectrum of consequences. The Silk Road was a double-edged sword, bringing prosperity with one hand and pestilence with the other. It reminds us that our interconnectedness, while offering immense benefits, also carries inherent vulnerabilities. The ancient world learned this lesson the hard way, as forgotten plagues repeatedly demonstrated the fragility of even the most powerful empires in the face of a relentless, invisible foe. From the vast, windswept steppes, our journey now takes a different turn, following the ancient currents of another mighty artery of life and death, the Nile. If the Silk Road taught us about the sweeping continental reach of disease, the story of the Nile whispers of a more localized, yet no less devastating cycle of pestilence, intimately tied to the very source of life itself. You find yourself standing on its banks, the sun beating down on your skin, the air thick with the scent of water, rich soil, and human endeavor. Imagine the fertile crescent of ancient Egypt, a ribbon of emerald green carved through an ocean of sand. This is where civilization bloomed, nourished by the annual inundation of the Nile, a miraculous gift that brought both bounty and peril. You gaze out at the river, its surface shimmering under the desert sun, reflecting the timeless rhythm of life and death it has always orchestrated. For millennia, the Nile was not merely a river, it was the bloodstream of a mighty empire, sustaining millions, allowing monumental cities to rise, pyramids to pierce the sky, and an unparalleled culture to flourish. But with this unparalleled gift came an equally powerful vulnerability. The same floodwaters that enriched the land also created vast, stagnant pools as they receded, perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes. You swat instinctively at an unseen insect, a tiny movement that echoes a daily struggle for countless generations. The silent hum of these insects carried a deadly payload. Malaria, a scourge that still afflicts millions today, was a constant companion in ancient Egypt. Its signature chills and fevers would have swept through villages, debilitating farmers during crucial harvest times, weakening soldiers, and slowly eroding the health of the populace. You can almost feel the burning forehead, the aching bones, the lethargy that steals your strength, forcing you to lie in the suffocating heat while the vital work of the fields goes undone. Think of entire workforces, perhaps thousands strong, building a pharaoh's tomb, suddenly reduced to a fraction by the insidious creep of this unseen enemy. The impact on productivity, on the very fabric of Egyptian society, would have been immense year after year. But malaria was just one thread in a complex tapestry of disease woven by the Nile. Look closer at the irrigation ditches, the canals, the very water that sustains life. It is here that another silent killer lurked, schistosomiasis or bilharzia. Microscopic worms, shed by freshwater snails living in the canals, would burrow into the skin of anyone wading in the water. You feel a faint itch, a phantom sensation on your ankles as you imagine the sensation of these parasites invading your body. Over years, these parasites would cause chronic fatigue, internal organ damage, and a slow, wasting sickness that could be mistaken for the natural decline of age. It was so prevalent that evidence of calcified eggs has been found in mummies dating back thousands of years. This was not a sudden, dramatic plague, but a relentless, systemic drain on the vitality of the Egyptian people, a constant, low-level hum of suffering that was simply part of life. Now, imagine a different kind of terror, a swift, brutal force that could sweep through a city like a desert storm. Historians and paleopathologists have found compelling evidence of much more acute epidemics that devastated ancient Egypt. Consider the discovery of smallpox lesions on the mummy of Pharaoh Ramses V, who died in the 12th century before the Common Era. You look at the scarred face, preserved for millennia, and the sudden horrific realization dawns on you. Even divine rulers were not immune. The distinctive pustules, the blinding fever, the agonizing pain, this disease would have struck with terrifying speed and lethality. For a society that revered physical perfection and believed in the divine nature of their pharaohs, such an affliction must have been profoundly disturbing, a challenge to their deepest beliefs. Think of the dense populations along the Nile, clustered in towns and cities. Sanitation by modern standards was rudimentary. The same river that supplied drinking water also received waste. You imagine the narrow, crowded streets of Memphis or Thebes, the close quarters, the intimate contact between people. These conditions were perfect for the rapid spread of airborne and waterborne diseases. Typhoid, dysentery, and other intestinal ailments would have been endemic, particularly among children, claiming lives with chilling regularity. Each death, a family shattered, a worker lost, a future unwritten. The curse of the pharaohs is a phrase often associated with supernatural revenge, but perhaps the true curse was the very environment that cradled their civilization. The Nile, while a giver of life, was also an unwitting accomplice to death. It connected communities but also diseases. It flooded, creating fertile land but also stagnant pools for vectors. It provided sustenance but also carried pathogens. The Egyptians, with their advanced medical knowledge for their time, understood much about injury and even some chronic ailments. Their physicians were renowned throughout the ancient world. They wrote extensive medical papyri detailing treatments, remedies, and surgical procedures. You can almost hear the soft rustle of papyrus, smell the earthy scent of ancient herbs, as a physician carefully examines a patient. But against the invisible, microscopic foes that caused epidemics, their understanding was limited. They attributed sickness to the wrath of gods, to malevolent spirits, or to imbalances in the body. While their magical incantations and elaborate rituals offered psychological comfort, they could do little to halt the relentless march of a virulent plague. Picture the scene during a severe outbreak. The bustling markets fall silent. Homes become places of fear and mourning. The great building projects, the very symbols of Egyptian power and resilience, would falter. Imagine the workers abandoning their posts, fleeing the cities, or simply succumbing to illness. The centralized administration, so crucial for coordinating the vast resources of the empire, would have been stretched to its breaking point. Food distribution, military campaigns, tax collection, all would have been disrupted, leading to potential famine, unrest, and a weakening of the pharaoh's authority. These forgotten plagues were not mere footnotes in the grand history of Egypt. They were active, shaping forces, influencing everything from demographics to religious beliefs, from daily life to dynastic stability. They are not as dramatic as invading armies, nor as tangible as economic collapses, but their cumulative impact over thousands of years was profound. They prevented population growth from reaching its full potential, ensuring that the labor force was always constrained. They instilled a deep-seated fear of disease, which permeated their religious practices and funerary rites, all designed in part to ward off sickness and secure a healthy afterlife. Even in later periods, when Egypt became a vital province of the Roman Empire, the cycle of plague continued, sometimes imported from distant lands, sometimes bubbling up from within its own unique ecology. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox or measles, devastated the Roman world in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and surely took a heavy toll on Egypt, a key breadbasket for the empire. Later, the plague of Justinian, a true bubonic plague, would sweep through the Mediterranean in the 6th century, originating in Africa and carried by rats on grain ships from Egypt. You stand there, listening to the gentle lapping of the Nile, and a profound realization settles over you. This ancient, enduring civilization, which created wonders that still captivate us today, was constantly battling an invisible enemy, one that resided in its water, in its air, and in its very interconnectedness. The grandeur of the pharaohs, the might of their armies, the wisdom of their priests, All were vulnerable to a flea bite, a mosquito sting, a microscopic worm. The story of ancient Egypt is not just one of monumental achievements, but also one of persistent struggle against the relentless, often forgotten power of disease. It is a stark reminder that even the most powerful empires, rooted in seemingly impenetrable strength, can be undone by the smallest of foes. You have witnessed the relentless invisible war waged against ancient Egypt. You have stood on the banks of the Nile, sensing the constant, microscopic threats that challenged even the most enduring civilization. Now let your mind travel across the vast, tumultuous oceans, not to a pristine, untouched land, but to a world shaped by its own unique microbial forces. Imagine standing on a high plateau in the Andes, the air thin and crisp, surveying a sprawling Inca city carved into the mountainside. Or perhaps you walk through the bustling market of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, a metropolis of canals and towering pyramids, vibrant with 1,000 sounds and smells. You might find yourself amidst the sprawling mounds of Cahokia, a Mississippian city of great influence, its earthworks reaching towards the sky. These civilizations, immense and complex, often conjure images of isolation, of lands untouched by the scourges of the Old World. But this perception, while holding a grain of truth about specific European diseases, overlooks a crucial reality. The Americas too were a battlefield against unseen invaders. Long before the arrival of European ships, the indigenous peoples of the Americas navigated a complex landscape of illness. Their bodies were not blank slates, but rather living histories of adaptation, resistance, and vulnerability to pathogens unique to their environments or those that had evolved alongside them over millennia. This was a world with a distinct epidemiological profile, different from Afro-Eurasia. With fewer domesticated animals like cattle, pigs, and sheep, the wellspring of many zoonotic diseases common in the Old World was less present. Yet, other threats thrived, shaping societies, influencing migrations, and leaving their indelible mark on the health and history of millions. Consider, for example, the pervasive shadow of tuberculosis. You might picture the crisp, clean air of the Andes, the vastness of the American plains. But even here an ancient adversary lay hidden. Tuberculosis, a disease we often associate with industrial-age Europe, was deeply entrenched in the Americas long before any European ship touched its shores. You see it in the bones of ancient Peruvian mummies, their spines twisted, their ribs fused, the telltale lesions etched into their skeletons. This was not a quick, dramatic plague, but a slow, wasting sickness, stealing strength, dimming eyes, and slowly consuming its victims from within. It spread through close quarters in the smoky confines of homes, in crowded marketplaces, and within the tightly knit social structures of villages and towns. For communities reliant on physical labor for agriculture, hunting, and construction, a lingering illness like tuberculosis represented a profound threat, debilitating individuals and weakening the collective strength of the group. Then there was the insidious presence of Chagas disease, particularly prevalent across vast stretches of Central and South America. Imagine a quiet evening in a thatched hut in the Amazon basin or a humble dwelling in the desert Southwest. As the cool air descends, tiny blood-sucking insects, often called kissing bugs, emerge from cracks in the walls or roof. They are drawn to the warmth of your breath, biting exposed skin, often around the lips or eyes. This bite, often unnoticed or dismissed, carries a microscopic parasite. For years, perhaps even decades, the infection might lie dormant, an invisible passenger within your body. Then, subtly at first, your heart begins to weaken, your digestive system struggles, perhaps your esophagus or colon abnormally enlarges, making eating or digestion a painful ordeal. This is Chagas disease, an invisible patient killer that silently afflicted millions across the continents, leaving a legacy of chronic illness and sudden death, often decades after the initial forgotten bite. Its impact on the heart would have been particularly devastating, affecting the most productive members of society. And what about the family of diseases known as treponematoses, which include syphilis? The exact origin of syphilis itself is a subject of historical debate, but compelling evidence suggests that related treponemal diseases were certainly present in the Americas long before European contact. You can examine ancient bones from North and South America and find the unmistakable signs: cranial lesions, bone deformities, and other skeletal markers that speak to a long history of these debilitating infections. Whether it was the venereal form of syphilis or its non-venereal cousins like yaws or Bigel, these diseases caused disfigurement, chronic pain, and systemic damage, undoubtedly impacting social dynamics, reproduction, and the overall health of communities. A young warrior might be sidelined by painful lesions. A mother might pass the infection to her child, perpetuating a cycle of suffering within families for generations. Beyond these more distinctive conditions, the Americas, like any populated land, grappled with a constant barrage of less dramatic but equally devastating ailments. Diarrheal diseases, spread through contaminated water and food, were relentless, especially among infants and young children. You understand the daily struggle to find and maintain clean water sources, to prevent the spread of waste, in a world without modern sanitation. These unseen pathogens, often bacteria or viruses, swept through communities, causing rapid dehydration and death, cutting short countless young lives before they could contribute to their societies. Parasitic infections, from hookworm to roundworm, were ubiquitous, silently sapping strength, causing anemia, and stunting growth in a significant portion of the population. While not always fatal, their chronic effects would have diminished the overall vigor and productivity of entire populations, making them more vulnerable to other illnesses and the daily grind of survival. In the face of these constant, invisible threats, pre-Columbian societies developed sophisticated systems of knowledge, healing, and spiritual belief. You would witness shamans and healers using an astounding array of medicinal plants, rituals, and surgical techniques. Their understanding of the human body and its ailments, while different from a modern medical perspective, was deeply empirical, born from generations of observation and experimentation. The spread of disease also shaped settlement patterns, influencing where communities chose to live based on water quality or the presence of insect vectors. It impacted trade routes, as people might avoid areas known for particular afflictions. Even warfare could be affected. A weakened population might be more susceptible to conquest, or conversely, a disease might halt an invading army in its tracks. These forgotten plagues were not just medical curiosities, they were active forces in the shaping of empires and cultures. They tested the resilience of the Inca, the Maya, and the Aztec, along with countless other nations and tribes across the two continents. They spurred innovations in medicine and public health, within the limitations of the era. They fostered specific cultural practices and spiritual beliefs aimed at warding off sickness and dealing with death. The societies of the Americas were not biologically naive. They were robust, dynamic communities that had long adapted to their own unique microbiological environment, developing their own forms of immunity and coping mechanisms against the invisible enemies that surrounded them. Therefore, when the ships from across the Atlantic finally arrived, carrying with them entirely new diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, they did not land on a blank canvas of health. Instead, they crashed into a world already engaged in its own long-standing, often brutal battle against illness. The subsequent devastation was not simply because the Americas were disease-free, but because their immune systems had never encountered these specific old-world pathogens. The forgotten plagues of pre-Columbian America underscore the profound truth that life, in all its vibrancy and complexity, has always existed in a delicate balance with the unseen microbial world, a balance that can be catastrophically disrupted when worlds collide. You stand at the edge of a world in transformation, a world where the delicate balance between humanity and the unseen microbial realm has been catastrophically disrupted. The ships from across the Atlantic have delivered not just soldiers and missionaries, but an invisible armada of pathogens, altering the course of empires and lives forever. While smallpox carved a brutal path through the Americas, weakening mighty civilizations, it was often merely the first devastating blow. Another, even more terrifying plague would follow, a specter known as Cocolitli. Imagine yourself now transported to the heart of the Aztec Empire, just after the initial shock waves of the first European diseases have passed. You are in Tenochtitlan, the magnificent city of canals and pyramids, bustling with life and vibrant commerce. Even as the Spanish solidify their tenuous grip, the resilient people of Mesoamerica continue to endure, adapting to the new realities, rebuilding what they can. But the worst is yet to come. The year is 1545. 2 decades have passed since the initial smallpox epidemic ravaged the continent. The wounds are still fresh, the population significantly reduced, but life persists. Then a new horror emerges from the unseen. The chroniclers of the time describe it as Cocolitli, a Nahuatl word often translated as pestilence or scourge. But these simple words cannot convey the sheer terror and devastation it unleashed. This was no ordinary illness. You begin to hear whispers, then cries, of a sickness that strikes with horrifying speed and brutality. It starts with an oppressive fever, a heat that burns through the body, leaving the afflicted weak and disoriented. Then comes a crushing headache so severe it feels as if your skull will split. Your body aches, every joint screaming in protest, every muscle racked with pain. The symptoms escalate rapidly, spiraling into a nightmare of internal suffering. You witness the victim's urine turn dark, almost black, a terrifying sign of what is happening within. Then the bleeding begins. Not just minor nosebleeds but profuse hemorrhaging from every orifice. Blood streams from the eyes, from the nose, from the mouth, mixing with vomit and bile. Skin begins to yellow, a stark contrast to the dark blood staining their garments. The most horrific aspect, perhaps, is the internal bleeding. Those afflicted suffer from painful abdominal distension, their bellies swelling as internal organs rupture and bleed. Large purpuric spots, dark red or purple blotches, appear on the skin as capillaries burst beneath the surface. The body is literally consuming itself, bleeding out from the inside. Death typically follows within 3 to 4 days of the first symptoms. It is swift, agonizing, and almost inevitable. You see it strike indiscriminately, felling the young and the old, the strong and the weak. Entire families, entire villages, are wiped out within weeks. The disease leaves no time for the body to build immunity, no chance for traditional healers to find a remedy. It moves like a wildfire, consuming all in its path. The scale of this catastrophe is almost impossible for you to comprehend. The population of central Mexico, estimated to be between 15 and 30 million before the Spanish arrival, had already been reduced by previous epidemics. Cocolitli would exact an even greater toll. Historians and demographers estimate that the 2 major Cocolitli epidemics, 1545 to 1548, and 1576 to 1578, killed between 7 million and 17 million people. Some regions saw up to 90% of their population vanish. You try to imagine the impact on society. The intricate social fabric of the Aztec Empire, already strained, unravels completely. Who tills the fields when everyone is sick or dying? Who cares for the children when their parents have succumbed? The harvest withers in the fields, leading to famine among the survivors. Trade routes are abandoned, markets fall silent, and the vibrant exchange of goods and ideas grinds to a halt. The dead are too numerous to bury. You see piles of bodies in the streets, in homes, in temples. The traditional rituals for the dead, so vital to Mesoamerican belief systems, become impossible. Mass graves are dug, filled with the hastily interred remains of those who once formed the backbone of a proud civilization. The psychological trauma on those who survived must have been immense, a generation living in the shadow of an ever-present, incomprehensible death. Their gods, their priests, their healers, nothing seemed capable of stopping the onslaught. For centuries, the precise identity of Kokolitli remained a medical mystery. Was it a form of typhus, smallpox, measles, or some unknown hemorrhagic fever? The descriptions were so vivid, yet so unique, that medical science struggled to pinpoint a definitive cause. Modern science, however, has begun to peel back the layers of this ancient enigma. You now possess tools that the chroniclers and early physicians could only dream of. In 2018, a groundbreaking study analyzed ancient DNA from the teeth of victims buried in one of the mass graves from the 1545 Kokolitli epidemic in Oaxaca, Mexico. The results were startling. Researchers identified the presence of Salmonella enterica subspecies Enterica cerevar paratyphi. This bacterium is known to cause enteric fever, a severe systemic illness with symptoms that eerily match the historical accounts of Kokolitli: high fever, headaches, abdominal pain, and often hemorrhagic complications and dark urine. It is a cousin to the bacterium that causes typhoid fever, but distinct. This discovery offered a compelling explanation for Kokolitli's devastating impact. Paratyphi was a pathogen likely brought from Europe, possibly by asymptomatic carriers among the Spanish or their domestic animals. The indigenous populations of the Americas had no prior exposure, no developed immunity to this specific microbial invader. Their immune systems, already weakened by previous Old World diseases and the stresses of conquest, were utterly unprepared. Furthermore, you must consider the environmental context. The 1545 epidemic occurred during a severe drought, following years of hardship and exploitation under Spanish rule. Poor nutrition, overcrowded living conditions, and the widespread disruption of sanitation systems would have created the perfect breeding ground for such a disease to spread like wildfire, overwhelming any natural defenses. Kokolitli was not merely a random misfortune. It was a perfect storm, a catastrophic convergence of a new highly virulent pathogen meeting an immunologically naive, already stressed population, amidst environmental degradation and societal upheaval. It was the ultimate invisible weapon, unintentionally wielded, yet profoundly effective in dismantling the very foundations of indigenous societies. The Aztec Empire, already brought to its knees by Cortés and his allies, was dealt its final irreparable blow by Kokolitli. It was not just superior weaponry or tactical brilliance that led to the collapse of these mighty empires. It was, perhaps more than anything else, the microbial invisible hand of history. The unseen enemies carried across oceans, transformed continents, reshaping human societies and setting the stage for the world you inhabit today. These forgotten plagues serve as a stark reminder of the fragile balance of life and the profound power of the microscopic world that constantly surrounds us. The unseen enemies carried across oceans, transformed continents, reshaping human societies and setting the stage for the world you inhabit today. These forgotten plagues serve as a stark reminder of the fragile balance of life and the profound power of the microscopic world that constantly surrounds us. But to fully grasp their monumental impact, you must understand that these microbial invasions did more than just destroy. They initiated a great reset, forging new worlds from the ashes of the old. Imagine you are standing in the bustling streets of 6th century Constantinople, the heart of the Roman Empire, a city of 1,000,000 souls, a vibrant crossroads of trade and culture. Emperor Justinian dreams of reuniting the shattered Roman world, pouring immense resources into military campaigns, grand construction projects, and the codification of law that still influences legal systems today. The empire pulses with ambition and wealth. But then an invisible shadow falls across the city. You see the first signs: a fever, swelling lymph nodes, a creeping exhaustion that steals the breath. This is the plague of Justinian, the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, a terrifying precursor to the Black Death that would follow centuries later. Carried by rats on trade ships from distant lands, it enters the city, then sweeps across the entire empire from North Africa to the Middle East into Europe. You witness the streets empty, once vibrant markets fall silent. The air, thick with the stench of death, carries a chilling quiet where laughter once echoed. Estimates suggest that it killed tens of millions, perhaps as much as half of the world's population at the time. Entire regions are depopulated. How does an empire recover from such a blow? It barely does. Justinian's grand vision crumbles. His armies, decimated by disease, cannot hold on to conquered territories. The economy collapses as there are too few hands to farm, to trade, to govern. The plague profoundly weakens the Eastern Roman Empire, leaving it vulnerable to new threats. It drains resources, shifts demographics, and creates a vacuum that other powers will eventually fill. This is not just a disaster, it is a fundamental reordering. It sets the stage for centuries of conflict and change in the Mediterranean world, paving the way for the rise of new empires and new faiths that would forever alter the course of history. The old Roman order, though it limped on, was irrevocably broken. Now, fast forward several centuries. You are in the crowded, bustling towns of 14th century Europe. The year is 1347. Europe is at a peak of population with growing cities, complex trade routes, and a deeply entrenched feudal system where peasants are tied to the land, their lives dictated by their lords. You can almost smell the wood smoke, the unwashed masses, the earthy scent of fields worked hard by many hands. But then again a ship arrives, this time in Sicily. On board are not just goods but death itself. The Black Death, a new, even more virulent strain of bubonic plague, has arrived. You hear the rumors, then see the horrifying reality unfold. People are healthy one day, dead the next, their bodies covered in dark, swollen buboes. Panic spreads faster than the disease. Priests cannot perform last rites quickly enough. Gravediggers cannot keep up with the endless stream of corpses. Families barricade themselves in their homes, but the plague finds them. You witness villages abandoned, fields left untended, entire towns reduced to skeletal populations. Within just a few years, between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population perishes. Imagine that. 1 in every 2 or 3 people you know gone. The demographic shock is almost incomprehensible. This is the ultimate reset, far more widespread and destructive than any war. But from this unimaginable devastation, a new world begins to emerge. Think of the impact on society. With so many dead, suddenly labor is scarce. For centuries, serfs were bound to the land, their lives dictated by their lord. But now you, a surviving peasant, have power. Lords desperately need hands to work their fields, to harvest their crops, to keep their estates running. You can demand wages. You can negotiate for better conditions. You can even leave for another village that offers more. The old feudal system, which relied on an abundance of cheap labor, begins to crack, then shatter. You see the rise of a new economic reality. Wages increase dramatically for the working class. With more disposable income, survivors demand better goods. This stimulates trade and the growth of a merchant class. Agricultural innovation becomes essential, as fewer people must produce enough food for everyone. New technologies and farming methods are adopted out of sheer necessity. The Black Death also profoundly shifts social and cultural perspectives. You might witness a surge in religious fervor as people desperately seek solace or meaning, but also a profound questioning of faith, as prayers go unanswered and the church itself seems helpless. The authority of institutions is challenged. People begin to live more in the present, enjoying what they have, leading to shifts in art, literature, and philosophy. The focus on individual experience and the value of human life takes on new meaning when life itself is so precarious. Politically, the landscape also changes. Weakened by the plague, some monarchies struggle, while others consolidate power as local authorities collapse. New forms of governance emerge from the chaos. The relationship between ruler and ruled, once so clearly defined by feudal ties, becomes more complex and renegotiated. The great population loss creates a different distribution of wealth and power, accelerating changes that might have taken centuries under normal circumstances. The devastation wrought by the Black Death did not just end an era. It ushered in the conditions that made the Renaissance possible, laid foundations for the age of exploration, and fundamentally altered the social contract between people and power. It was a brutal, involuntary reset, but a reset nonetheless, leading to a more dynamic, albeit often turbulent, future. And so you see a pattern emerging. Whether it is the concomitantly devastating the indigenous populations of the Americas and allowing for colonial expansion, or the plague of Justinian weakening an ancient empire and creating space for new ones, or the Black Death tearing apart feudal Europe and giving birth to a more modern economy, plagues are not merely destructive forces. They are catalysts. They expose weaknesses in existing systems, create immense vacuums, and force societies to adapt, to innovate, and to rebuild in profoundly different ways. The worlds that emerge from these periods of intense microbial pressure are almost always new worlds, shaped by the ghosts of the lost, but built by the resilience and adaptability of the survivors. They are a testament to humanity's enduring struggle against the microscopic, and a stark reminder that even the smallest, unseen enemy can utterly transform the course of human civilization, wiping the slate clean and inviting a great, often terrifying, reset. The power of these forgotten plagues is not just in their capacity to kill, but in their astonishing ability to reshape the very foundations of human existence. You stand on the precipice of history, looking back at the profound, often terrifying resets that microscopic enemies have forced upon humanity. We have touched upon the well-known titans, the Justinian plague and the Black Death, whose names echo through the centuries with the weight of millions lost. But what of the others? What of the silent, unseen scourges that swept through civilizations, shaking empires to their very foundations, yet remain largely forgotten by the popular imagination? These are the forgotten fevers, the hidden histories of contagion that carved new paths for nations and peoples, leaving behind not just graves, but entirely new worlds. Imagine yourself in the heart of the Roman Empire, not at its triumphant zenith, but in the late 2nd century after the birth of Christ. It is a time of immense power, wealth, and sophisticated culture. You walk through the bustling forum, the air thick with the murmur of 1,000 conversations, the scent of baking bread and sacrificial smoke, the clang of tools from distant workshops. Legionaries, their chests puffed with pride from distant conquests, march in orderly columns. Senators debate affairs of state in hallowed halls. Life here feels eternal, unshakable. The empire stretches from the sands of North Africa to the cold forests of Britannia, a testament to human ingenuity and power. But then a whisper begins. It travels on the dusty roads, carried by returning soldiers from the eastern frontier, veterans of campaigns in Parthia. At first, it is dismissed as camp fever, a minor inconvenience of military life. But the whisper grows into a murmur, then a shout, and finally, a guttural scream of terror. This is the Antonine Plague, named for the imperial dynasty then in power. It sweeps through the ranks of the legions like a reaper through wheat. You hear stories of soldiers returning, their bodies covered in pustules and sores, their skin hot with fever, their breath ragged. They cough, they seize, and they die in droves. You watch as the plague follows the returning armies, tracing the meticulously built Roman roads, hopping onto trade ships that ply the Mediterranean. It infiltrates the crowded cities, the sprawling villas, the humble village huts. You see the faces of fear in the marketplace, where once boisterous vendors now stand silent, their eyes darting nervously at every cough, every sniffle. Temples, usually filled with offerings and prayers for prosperity, now overflow with desperate pleas for healing. The disease, thought by many modern scholars to be smallpox or measles, is merciless. It devastates populations, striking down young and old, rich and poor, slave and free with chilling impartiality. You hear the ceaseless wail of mourners, a sound that quickly becomes as ubiquitous as the chattering of doves on rooftops. The dead are piled high, sometimes burned in mass graves, sometimes left in the streets as the living become too few or too sick to bury them. The vibrant pulse of Roman life begins to falter. The economy grinds to a halt. Fields lie fallow as farmers succumb or flee. Workshops fall silent. The supply of grain from Egypt dwindles. Inflation bites deep, eroding the wealth of families who have held fortunes for generations. You witness the once mighty legions, the backbone of Roman power, severely depleted. Recruitment becomes a desperate struggle. The empire, already stretched thin, finds itself fighting on multiple fronts with a fraction of its former strength. Barbarian tribes, sensing weakness, press against the borders with renewed vigor. The very fabric of Roman society unravels. Trust erodes. Doctors, helpless in the face of this invisible killer, are scorned or killed. Superstition flourishes. You see people turn to cults, to desperate rituals, anything that promises a sliver of hope or an explanation for the unfolding horror. The Antonine Plague claims the lives of emperors and philosophers alike, including the revered Marcus Aurelius, or at least significantly weakens him before his eventual death. Its long shadow stretches for nearly 2 decades, fundamentally altering the course of the Roman Empire, eroding its strength, and setting the stage for centuries of decline and transformation. It weakened Rome from within, making it more vulnerable to the external pressures that would ultimately bring it to its knees. But the empire, resilient though wounded, struggles on. Decades pass. New emperors rise and fall, grappling with the profound changes wrought by the Antonine Plague. Just as a semblance of stability begins to return, another pestilence descends, even more terrifying, even more devastating. This is the Plague of Cyprian, erupting in the mid-3rd century. Named after Saint Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage who vividly described its horrors, this plague is a particularly gruesome one, possibly a hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola or Marburg virus. You hear accounts of its symptoms: incessant vomiting, burning fevers, intestinal agony, and a terrifying putrefaction of the body that began even before death. People describe limbs rotting, eyes going blind, and ears growing deaf, all while the victim was still alive and suffering. The smell of death hangs heavy in the air, a sickeningly sweet aroma that clings to clothes and hair. This time the fear is absolute, primal. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Rome or Alexandria during the height of this plague. The silence is deafening, broken only by the sporadic cries of the afflicted and the scraping sound of carts collecting bodies. Shop doors are barred. Homes are empty, their occupants either dead or fled to the countryside in a desperate, often futile, attempt to escape the contagion. You see families abandoning their sick, mothers leaving their children, husbands their wives, in a desperate, self-preserving panic that strips away the veneer of civilization. The Plague of Cyprian, like its predecessor, ravages the population. Estimates suggest it may have killed a quarter or even a third of the inhabitants of the empire's major cities. Rome itself is decimated. Its population plummets, further weakening its already strained economy and military. The empire enters a period known as the Crisis of the 3rd century, a time of rampant civil war, economic collapse, and constant barbarian incursions. The 2 plagues, the Antonine and the Cyprian, bookend this period of intense instability, acting as powerful accelerators of Rome's unraveling. They thinned the population, destroyed social cohesion, disrupted trade, and crippled the state's ability to defend itself. The memory of these plagues faded over time, overshadowed by later, even more catastrophic events like the Black Death. Yet their impact was profound and lasting. They did not just kill, they reshaped the very demographics, economics, and political structures of the Roman world. They fostered an environment of anxiety and uncertainty that contributed to the rise of new religious beliefs, including Christianity, which offered solace and hope in a world consumed by suffering and death. These forgotten fevers are not mere footnotes in history. They are powerful narratives of human vulnerability and resilience. They remind you that the grand narratives of empires rising and falling are often intricately intertwined with the unseen battles fought against the smallest of foes. These microscopic agents of change cleared the way for new ideas, new leaders, and ultimately new worlds to emerge from the ashes of the old. Their silence in many history books belies their immense power to utterly transform the course of human civilization, wiping the slate clean and inviting a great, often terrifying reset. The power of these forgotten plagues is not just in their capacity to kill, but in their astonishing ability to reshape the very foundations of human existence. You stand at the precipice of understanding, looking back at a tapestry of human history woven not just with grand battles and heroic leaders, but with threads so fine they are invisible to the naked eye. These are the threads of microscopic life, the silent architects of empires, the unseen monarchs who have shaped the very foundations of human existence. You have seen how their power can wipe the slate clean, inviting terrifying resets. Now, let us delve deeper into how these tiny tyrants actually achieved such colossal feats. Imagine yourself in the heart of the Roman Empire, a bustling metropolis of stone and ambition. You feel the pulse of its power, the order of its legions, the weight of its laws. But then a new whisper begins, a cough, a fever. This is the Antonine Plague, striking in the 2nd century, and later the Plague of Justinian in the 6th century. You witness cities, once vibrant, become silent and eerie. The marketplaces, usually teeming with life, grow quiet. Soldiers, the backbone of imperial might, fall ill in their barracks. You see the legions, already stretched thin across vast borders, dwindle. Who will defend the frontiers when the very air within the city walls carries a more formidable enemy than any barbarian horde? The plague does not care for social standing or military prowess. It sweeps through the population indiscriminately, felling emperors and commoners alike. You observe the profound economic shockwaves. Farms lie untended, their harvests rotting, for there are simply not enough hands to work the fields. Trade routes, once arteries of wealth, become conduits of disease and fear. The imperial treasury, accustomed to taxes from a thriving populace, now faces dwindling revenues and soaring costs for burials and care. You hear the mournful cries echoing through the streets, the constant tolling of bells, a soundtrack of sorrow that slowly erodes the very confidence of the people in their once invincible empire. The consequences for governance are catastrophic. You see the intricate bureaucracy, once a model of efficiency, grind to a halt as administrators sicken and die. Leadership falters, decision-making becomes erratic. The social fabric, already under strain, begins to fray as fear and superstition take hold. You might have walked past a thriving philosophical debate just weeks ago, but now you see people turning to desperate prayers, to new faiths offering solace in the face of incomprehensible death. This is how the ground is tilled for new ideologies, how established powers weaken, leaving a void for something else to emerge. The Roman Empire did not fall in a single dramatic crash. It was a slow, agonizing bleed, often exacerbated, if not directly caused, by these invisible assailants. Fast forward centuries, and you find yourself in medieval Europe, where another, even more devastating scourge is about to unleash itself. The Black Death, arriving in the mid-14th century, is not merely an epidemic, it is an epoch-defining cataclysm. You feel the chill wind of its approach, carried on the sails of merchant ships from the east. You see its rapid, merciless spread across continents, leaving a trail of death that defies imagination. 1/3, perhaps even half, of Europe's population perishes. Imagine the sheer scale of this loss. You walk through villages where every single house stands empty, through towns where the streets are silent except for the wind. The agricultural system, the very basis of medieval society, collapses. The land, once meticulously worked, now lies fallow. But here you notice a profound shift. With so few survivors, the value of labor skyrockets. The serf, once tied to the land, now has leverage. You hear the demands for better wages, for freedom. The old feudal order, with its rigid hierarchy, begins to crack under the weight of this demographic revolution. The church too faces a crisis of faith. You hear the questions whispered in hushed tones: why has God abandoned us? Why do the righteous suffer alongside the wicked? The clergy, often the most exposed due to their duties to the sick and dying, suffer immense losses. This leads to a decline in quality and a questioning of spiritual authority that paves the way for future reforms and new ways of thinking. You witness the birth of a new individualism, a greater focus on worldly pleasures, and a re-evaluation of life's precious brevity. The Black Death did not just kill millions. It reshaped the very foundations of European society, economy, and spiritual life, unknowingly laying some of the groundwork for the Renaissance in the modern world. Now shift your gaze across the vast Atlantic to the Americas, a continent vibrant with diverse civilizations flourishing for millennia. You stand on the shores alongside the first European explorers, but what you also witness, unknowingly, is the arrival of an invisible invasion far more potent than any armada. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, these diseases endemic in Europe for centuries, are entirely new to the indigenous populations of the Americas. You see the devastating impact. Whole villages are wiped out before a single European soldier ever sets foot in them. The empires of the Aztecs and the Incas, formidable in their military might and complex social structures, are crippled not just by Spanish steel, but by a plague that decimates their armies, their leaders, and their entire social fabric. You observe the sheer incomprehension as entire families sicken and die, believing themselves cursed, or their gods abandoning them. This biological asymmetry, this uninvited microbial warfare, is a critical, often understated factor in the European conquest. It creates power vacuums, shatters resistance, and leaves populations too weakened to defend themselves effectively. Consider the narrative of conquest. You are often told of the superior weaponry or tactical brilliance of the conquistadors. While these played a role, imagine trying to maintain an empire, to raise an army, or to cultivate food, when 90% of your population has been wiped out by an unseen enemy. You witness the collapse of societal knowledge, of oral traditions, of intricate agricultural practices, as the elders and keepers of wisdom succumb to disease. The very memory of these vibrant civilizations is threatened. This is not just a demographic catastrophe, it is an epidemic one, erasing vast swathes of human knowledge and experience. The power of these microscopic monarchs extends beyond sweeping plagues. You see their influence in smaller, more insidious ways, shaping the outcomes of wars, dictating the fates of expeditions. Think of Napoleon's ill-fated invasion of Russia. Not merely the brutal Russian winter, but typhus, dysentery, and other diseases decimated his grand army, weakening it profoundly before a single major battle was fought. You follow the long marches, the crowded, unsanitary encampments, perfect breeding grounds for disease. The lines of retreating soldiers are not just starving and frozen. They are sick and dying, their strength sapped by unseen adversaries. You realize that every major human migration, every trade route, every war, has been a potential vector for these invisible forces. They are the constant companions of human ambition, sometimes turning the tide, sometimes clearing the path. They decide which populations thrive and which diminish, which cultures persist and which fade, often without any conscious human intent. They are the ultimate agents of natural selection, operating on a societal scale. These forgotten fevers force you to reconsider the very concept of power. It is not just held by kings, armies, or economic might. It is also wielded by organisms too small to see, yet capable of dismantling the most intricate human constructs. They remind you of the profound interconnectedness of life, where the health of a single organism can ripple through entire civilizations. You are left with a deeper appreciation for the delicate balance of human societies and their environment. The resilience of humanity, in the face of such overwhelming biological onslaughts, is truly remarkable. Yet, the scars remain, etched into the historical record. a testament to the fact that the greatest threats sometimes come from the smallest sources. The microbial world, unseen and largely unacknowledged in the grand narratives, stands as a formidable force, continually reshaping our path, clearing the ground and forever redefining the very meaning of empire. These microscopic monarchs, in their silent and relentless reign, ensure that human history is a story of constant flux, an ongoing dialogue between our ambitions and the unseen forces that profoundly shape them. They are the ultimate arbiters of fortune, the quiet architects of demographic shifts, the unforeseen agents of cultural exchange, and the undeniable catalysts for monumental change. You now carry this understanding with you, looking at the rise and fall of civilizations through a different lens, one that acknowledges the profound, often terrifying, power of the microscopic world. Their silent work continues, reminding you that history is not just made by people, but also by the invisible empires of germs. You now hold a profound understanding. The unseen world, the microscopic realm, is not merely a passive backdrop to human history. It is an active, shaping force, capable of dismantling empires and redirecting the very currents of civilization. But what happens when the invisible enemy manifests with such ferocity that it threatens the very fabric of human existence? What transpires when these silent monarchs, these microbial emperors, levy their most devastating taxes on the living? This is the story of humanity's enduring battle, an account of the forgotten plagues that did not merely sicken, but reshaped, redefined, and sometimes nearly extinguished the grandest ambitions of our ancestors. Journey with me now, back to a time when medical science was in its infancy, when the very concept of a germ was millennia away, and when the only explanations for widespread death were divine wrath or malevolent spirits. Picture yourself first in the bustling heart of ancient Athens, in the 5th century before the Common Era. It is a city alight with intellectual vigor, a beacon of democracy, art and philosophy, locked in a bitter war for supremacy with its rival, Sparta. The Peloponnesian War rages, a conflict that will define a generation. Suddenly an enemy unlike any other appears. It arrives not on Spartan ships, nor with their formidable hoplites, but stealthily, invisibly. In 430 before the Common Era, a devastating plague descends upon Athens. You witness it firsthand. The city, overcrowded with refugees from the countryside, becomes a fertile ground for its spread. People are struck down with terrifying speed. You see the agonizing symptoms: sudden fevers, burning eyes, bloody throats, difficulty breathing, skin erupting in pustules and ulcers. The suffering is immense, the death toll astronomical. Imagine the panic that ripples through the city. Physicians, powerless and bewildered, fall victim themselves. The sick are abandoned for fear of contagion. The very social contract begins to unravel. Funerals, once sacred rites, become hasty, unceremonious affairs. Bodies pile up in the streets, left unburied as the living struggle to survive. The laws of the city, once so revered, are disregarded as people indulge in desperate hedonism, believing they have no future. Morality erodes under the weight of omnipresent death. The plague decimates Athens, killing perhaps a quarter to a third of its population, including its brilliant leader Pericles. It cripples their military efforts, weakens their spirit, and ultimately contributes to their defeat in the Peloponnesian War. This invisible foe, more than any Spartan spear, forever alters the course of Greek history, demonstrating that even the most advanced and powerful city-state is vulnerable to the unseen. Now, fast forward centuries. You find yourself immersed in the vast, sophisticated expanse of the Roman Empire, around 165 of the Common Era. This is Rome at the height of its power, a colossus stretching from Britain to the deserts of North Africa, from the Atlantic to Mesopotamia. Its legions are invincible, its infrastructure unparalleled, its culture dominant. But a new threat emerges, one that rides home not on victorious chariots, but within the bodies of returning soldiers. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox or measles, is brought back by troops campaigning in the Near East. You stand in a crowded Roman marketplace as the news spreads, then the sickness itself. It sweeps through the empire like a wildfire, touching every province, every city, every villa. You hear accounts of millions perishing, entire towns depopulated. The meticulous records of the Roman state, usually so precise, begin to falter under the sheer weight of death. Witness the consequences. The mighty Roman army, the backbone of the empire, struggles with recruitment as so many are lost. Frontier defenses weaken, inviting barbarian incursions. The economy falters as trade routes are disrupted and labor becomes scarce. You see the despair etched on the faces of people, the sense of a world being undone. The philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a figure of stoic strength, spends much of his reign grappling with this invisible enemy, seeing his beloved empire slowly eroded from within. The Antonine Plague is not a single catastrophic event, but a series of outbreaks that last for decades. It profoundly weakens Rome, contributing to the military, economic, and political crises that will ultimately lead to its decline. It sparks a spiritual shift, too, as people seek solace in new religions, questioning the old gods who seem unable to protect them. The plague leaves an indelible scar, a haunting reminder that even the most enduring empire can be brought to its knees by the silent, relentless march of disease. Shift your perspective once more. The year is 541 of the Common Era. You are in Constantinople, the dazzling capital of the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Justinian dreams of restoring the glory of the old Roman Empire, reclaiming lost territories and uniting the Christian world. His armies are formidable, his building projects magnificent. This city, a crossroads of continents, is a hub of trade and culture, teeming with life. Then the true horror arrives. The plague of Justinian, the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, bursts forth from Egypt. It reaches Constantinople through rats stowing away on grain ships. You are present as the city is consumed. The disease, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, strikes with brutal efficiency. People develop painful swellings, known as buboes, in their groins and armpits, followed by fever, delirium, and often swift death. The scale of mortality is almost incomprehensible. You see the streets become choked with corpses, bodies piling up faster than they can be buried. The emperor himself falls ill, though he recovers. The very machinery of the empire grinds to a halt. Trade ceases. Farms are abandoned. Fear becomes a constant companion, a heavy cloak draped over every living soul. Stories emerge of ghostly figures appearing to people, striking them down with an unseen hand. The world feels as if it is ending. The plague of Justinian devastates the Byzantine Empire, killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people in its initial wave, and millions more in subsequent recurrences over the next 2 centuries. It cripples Justinian's grand ambitions, draining his resources and manpower, preventing the full restoration of the Roman Empire. The plague weakens the Byzantines, making them vulnerable to future invasions and contributing to the geopolitical shifts that would reshape the Mediterranean world, paving the way for the rise of Islam. It casts a long shadow over the early medieval period, marking a true turning point in European and Near Eastern history. These aren't merely ancient anecdotes. These forgotten plagues are vivid testaments to a perennial struggle. They remind you that even the most formidable human endeavors, the grandest empires and the most brilliant civilizations, are perpetually engaged in an unseen battle for survival against forces that operate on a microbial scale. The plague of Athens, the Antonine Plague, and the plague of Justinian illustrate that disease has been an unyielding architect of historical change, a silent partner in the rise and fall of nations. Yet, in their wake, humanity endured. Even amidst such overwhelming devastation, communities eventually rebuilt. Knowledge was lost, but new knowledge was gained. Societies adapted, sometimes slowly, sometimes through radical transformation. The survivors, forever marked by the memory of such widespread death, found ways to carry on, to innovate, and to rebuild. They are a testament not only to the destructive power of disease but also to the astonishing resilience of the human spirit, its enduring will to survive, to learn, and to strive for a future, even when faced with existential threats that challenge the very definition of civilization. The battle for survival against the invisible continues, a constant, humbling reminder of our place in the natural world. You stand at the edge of an ancient city, not amidst its suffering, but in the hush that follows the storm. The immediate terror of the plague has subsided, the wails faded into silence. Yet an unseen shroud still lingers, a psychic residue clinging to the very stones, to the air you breathe. The ground beneath your feet cradles the untold stories of those who vanished, lives abruptly truncated by an invisible enemy. This is not merely an absence, it is a profound alteration. The world you inhabit now, even centuries later, bears the indelible scars of these forgotten plagues. Consider the aftermath of the Antonine Plague. You watch as Rome, the eternal city, slowly attempts to stir back to life. But it is a different city. The legions, once the unyielding backbone of the empire, are depleted. Their ranks, thinned by disease and battle, struggle to maintain order across vast territories. You see the stress lines on emperors like Marcus Aurelius, who witnessed its indiscriminate devastation. The economic engine sputters. Trade routes, once bustling, are now fraught with fear and suspicion, slowing the flow of vital resources. The land, once meticulously cultivated, lies fallow, awaiting workers who will never return. You walk through a market, once vibrant, now subdued. The faces are fewer, older, more somber. There is a palpable shift in the societal fabric. Labor becomes incredibly valuable, the surviving workers finding unexpected leverage. Yet, this newfound power is a cold comfort born from the death of their kin. The social order, once rigidly defined, begins to show cracks under the pressure of mass casualty. Those who survived carry not just physical immunity, but a deep psychological burden. They witnessed incomprehensible horrors, a scale of death that challenged their understanding of justice, divinity, and life's meaning. This era gives rise to new spiritual fervor and questions about existence, as people seek solace in overwhelming randomness. Then shift your gaze across the Mediterranean to the Byzantine Empire, facing the grip of the plague of Justinian. You stand in the magnificent Hagia Sophia, once a beacon of spiritual and imperial power. But even here, in the heart of Constantinople, the whispers of death are inescapable. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the disease, miraculously recovering, but his vision of a reunited Roman Empire was mortally wounded. The capital's bustling population was decimated. Imagine governing an empire when a quarter, a third, or more of your populace has simply vanished. You see the deserted workshops, empty homes, quiet streets. The infrastructure of the state begins to crumble, hollowed out by the relentless attrition of disease. The plague of Justinian leaves an enduring legacy of fear and transformation. You observe slow, reactive shifts in urban planning. Cities begin to consider sanitation, though rudimentarily. Burial practices evolve as existing cemeteries overflow. The concept of quarantine, though not formalized, begins to emerge intuitively as communities learn that isolating the sick can slow the spread. The collective memory of such an event, passed down through generations, shapes cultural narratives and even religious texts. Disease becomes personified, a terrifying entity woven into the tapestry of daily life. These are not merely historical footnotes, they are shadows of the past stretching into our present. The term forgotten plagues is poignant, for while specific names and dates might recede, their impact echoes through time. Why do we forget? Perhaps it is a survival mechanism, a human tendency to move forward, to bury unbearable memories. Or perhaps it is a flaw, a failure to heed the unspoken warnings these catastrophes present. You walk through the silent ruins of a once thriving port city. The wind whispers through the stones, carrying the unspoken warnings of those who lived and died here. The first warning is about vulnerability. No empire, however powerful or advanced, is immune to microscopic forces. The Romans, with unparalleled might, were brought to their knees not by barbarians, but by an unseen enemy. The Byzantines, heirs to Rome's glory, found their dreams shattered by a single bacterial strain. This teaches profound humility. Humanity, for all its ingenuity, remains inextricably part of nature, subject to unseen whims. A second warning speaks to interconnectedness. Plagues spread along civilization's arteries, trade routes, military campaigns, pilgrimage paths. The same ships carrying exotic goods also carried fleas and rats, unwitting vectors. Roads facilitating imperial control also became highways for contagion. This demonstrates global connectivity, while bringing prosperity, also creates pathways for global threats. As you imagine the ancient world, you see that the idea of isolated communities untouched by disease was already becoming a myth. Our world, with supersonic travel, is merely an amplification of this ancient truth. What happens in one corner can, and often does, affect every other. A third, more subtle warning emerges from societal responses. You observe initial panic, scapegoating, the breakdown of social order. But then also gradual adaptation, the desperate search for solutions, the eventual rebuilding. It highlights the critical role of strong governance, public health, and accurate information, even in nascent forms. Where leadership faltered, chaos reigned. Where communities supported each other, even without scientific understanding, they fared marginally better. The seeds of public health measures, like isolating the sick or safely disposing of the dead, were planted in the tragic soil of these ancient epidemics. And a fourth warning, perhaps most critical for our time, is about the cyclical nature of these threats. Pathogens change, diseases evolve, but the fundamental challenge remains constant. Humanity will always face new diseases, new mutations, new microscopic adversaries. The story of these plagues is not just historical. It is a timeless narrative about our ongoing struggle to understand, prevent, and overcome the invisible forces that shape our destiny. You stand here, centuries later, realizing these historical shadows are not simply relics of a bygone era. They are a mirror reflecting our own potential vulnerabilities, our own need for vigilance. These forgotten plagues are not just cautionary tales. They are urgent dispatches from history's front lines. They tell you that complacency is a dangerous luxury. They whisper that scientific inquiry, even when slow and imperfect, is our most potent shield. They remind you that compassion and collective action are not just moral imperatives, but practical necessities during widespread suffering. You look at the grand structures of these ancient civilizations, their triumphs and their falls, and see that disease, that unseen architect, played an undeniable role. The challenge, then, for you and for humanity, is to listen to these whispers. To learn from the forgotten, to remember lessons carved into history by disease's unseen hand. The echoes of the past are not just somber reminders of what was lost. They are urgent calls to action, blueprints for resilience and survival. They tell you that the battle against the invisible is never truly over, only paused. And in that pause, in the quiet aftermath of ancient devastation, you hear history's clear, strong voice, urging you to prepare, adapt, and endure.